Good evening, everyone. We continue our study in the book of Leviticus. We're now in chapter 13, continuing on from verse 18. By way of review, please be aware that the entire chapter is about declaring someone clean or unclean from the standpoint of a skin disorder. If the skin disorder is by definition unclean because it is a contagious situation, then the priest does the declaration. The details we see in chapter 13 is for the priest to know what to do and for the affected person to understand why it is being done a certain way. Now, obviously, there is a much more information that is to be conveyed to the Kohanim, but suffice for us as we read chapter 13 that we have a clear picture that it is God's decision that certain state would be declared unclean. So the person needs to deal with the uncleanness, the tameh, so that he can become taher, to be clean again. We ended in verse 17, and today in verse 18, he says this: if the flesh, I think this will be important, if the flesh develops a boil would be an inflammation. An inflammation on the skin. Now, skin, remember yesterday we talked, is the covering of the body. If that is the case, if flesh develops on the inflammation, uh, and it will have healed, it's supposed to have healed, but now you see flesh developing on that boil. And in the place of the inflammation, there comes a white swelling or a bright spot. And this means reddish white. Now, reddish white would be something like it is white because there is a change of color. The pigmentation is affected. It is reddish because there is blood streaks or veins that is showing. And if this is the case, when it is supposed to be healed, that is what this means. It's supposed to be healed, and yet flesh grows on top of the inflammation, then it shall be shown to the Kohen. See, chapter 13 is really a lot of information that is instructing the priest. And if the priest sees it, remember, everything is about visual. There is nothing to do with microscope or scientific testing. It is inspection, careful inspection, and examination. So we would say that when the priest examines it by visual, and indeed it appears deeper than the skin. Anything that's deeper than the skin is going to be problematic. Then its hair has turned white. Remember, we talked about it yesterday. At least 2 hairs to be a confirmation. Then the priest shall pronounce him unclean, and that would be tameh. As we have known, anyone in this predicament declared as unclean, everyone will shun him. This is supposed to be now a leprous sore, a nega zara, which has broken out of the inflammation. Every time you see this word boil, it's an inflammation. We're not told how bad it is. But when the priest sees it carefully, and indeed there are no white hairs in it. Now, no white hairs is good news. Because if hair has turned white, it is bad news. If there is no white hair and it is not deeper than the skin, but seems to have faded, then the priest shall isolate him. Now, this idea in verse 21, the idea of isolation is to shut up. I guess we can also call him quarantine. Shall quarantine him 7 days. And if it spread over the skin, then it's bad. Then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. Tame. This is a negar zara. That is important. A negar zara. A leprous bruise, if you want to call it that way. Now, if the bright spot stays in one place, it doesn't move, it doesn't spread, then it is the scar of the boil. And the priest shall pronounce him taher. So in verse 23, we have the difference here. And it is all a pronouncement because the moment one is pronounced as unclean, the person can't come to approach God. There is no offering that can be accepted, and the people will shun him, and he has to be isolated. Now we see this in verse 24. It says, if a person on the flesh receives a burn on its skin by fire. This will be a fire burn. So there is fire that burned the skin, and the raw of the burn, that is the raw flesh, becomes a bright spot, reddish white or white. Now this is important because it it needs to be red, but if it's reddish white or white, it's turning white of some sort. Then the priest shall examine it, inspect it closely. And this is to see, observe. Everything is visual. And the condition is if the hair of the bright spot has turned white. Remember, 2 hairs to be exact at least. On the bright spot has turned white. Then we have a situation. It says here that it appears deeper than the skin. Then Zara has broken out in the burn. Now, leprosy is the contamination that everyone wants to stay away from. Zara. The burn itself has allowed Zara to fester. And so we see here, therefore the priest shall pronounce him unclean. Tame. It is a leprous sore. It's a negat zara. But if the priest examines it, remember the examination is inspection, observe carefully. Indeed, there are no white hairs on the bright spot. And it is not deeper than the skin. It's very important that it's not below the skin, but has faded, then the priest shall isolate him 7 days. Quarantine. This is for precaution. The priest examines him, observes him again on the seventh day. If it had at all spread over the skin, then that's bad. Then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous sore. But if the bright spot stays in one place, did not spread, faded, and then it's a swelling from the burn, the priest shall pronounce him clean, for it is a scar from the burn. So they have to be able to tell whether it's clean or unclean because the situation is that the Kohanim must ensure that this person is clean, not well. Please be aware, this person has undergone an accident by fire, being burned. So it's not about him being healed in a short period of time, but to be very clear that this is not a skin disorder or skin disease. If it is not a skin disease, then it is clean. If it is a skin disease, then it is unclean. Verse 29. Verse 29 then describes another situation. It says that if a man or a woman, and now we have this idea, a sore on the head or the beard. This word sore uh, really means an affliction, a stroke, a naga. I think this word here, nega or naga, is a bruise. A bruise means a spot that is unusual. It is a different color. It's not your regular skin. Something has struck that part. That's the point. Then on the head would be the scalp. If it is on the scalp or in the beard area, then the priest shall examine the bruise. And indeed, it appears deeper than the skin every time it is the priest's work to examine. So the examining is close looking, and in it, thin yellow hair, not white hair, thin yellow hair in this particular case. Then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. This is the rule. No longer white here. And so the idea is it is a scaly leprosy of the head or the scalp or beard. This will be described in verse 30. It is a skin disease, uh, necktie, a scaly leprosy. Uh, this would be actually a zara on the head. You can have zara all over the body, and this would be zara on the scalp or the beard area. But if the priest examines closely, look at the scaly sore. Now, this scaly sore is the nega, and it is not deeper than the skin. Does not appear means visually there is no black hair in it. Then the priest shall isolate for 7 days. Now, this idea of the nega, because it is suspicious, 7 days. And on the seventh day, the priest shall examine the sore, again, the nega, and if indeed the scale, the idea here of the scale or the scab uh, has not spread and no yellow hair in it. Notice this is about thin yellow hair. And the scale or the scab is different. The scale does not appear deeper than the skin. This is a netek. It doesn't appear to be deeper than the skin. Then he shall shave himself. This is important. In 33, the idea of shaving is galak, and it really talks about removing the hair, cutting it off the head, and be bald. So he shall be bald. That is what this word shave actually means. Remove all the hair, but he does not remove the netek, the place where he's supposed to have a sore, and the priest will quarantine him for another 7 days. So there is always this concession. If it is still suspicious, let's wait for another 7 days. On the next seventh day, the priest shall examine him again, and if the scale has not spread over the skin, does not appear deeper than the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. Now, he is expected to wash his clothes and be clean. This idea of wash, again, I highlight to you, immerse. Immerse, to wash and be declared taher. But if the scale should spread all over the skin after his cleansing, meaning after the 14 days that the priest thinks that it's all okay, and then suddenly the scab should start to spread, then the priest must examine him, must take a look again to determine if the scab has spread over the skin. The priest need not seek for yellow hair. Why? Because now it is spreading, and once it's spreading, he is considered tameh. But if the scab appears to be at a standstill, it doesn't grow, and then there is black hair coming out in it, oh, that's okay, because black hair is normal. Then that scab is healed. Then he is taher, and the priest shall pronounce him taher. This is a pronouncement. This is important because the declaration is always by the Kohanim. Verse 38. So it says, if a man or woman has bright spots. Now, the idea of bright spots is called bacherot. So this is their bacherot. Bright spot on the skin of the body or the flesh, I think is a better word. Particularly white colored spots. Now you understand this. The concern here for the Kohanim is to look for white, if not bright yellow hair or white colored hair, and white colored spots, because white color is a determining factor of leprosy. Then it is said that the priest shall examine. This is what it means, that the priest shall see, the priest shall look, the priest shall examine. This is the right word. It is to examine. Only the priest to do that. The reason for the priest to examine is the determination of unclean or clean. The priest is not a doctor. And indeed, if the bright spot on the skin are dull white, it is a spot that grows on the skin, he is clean. So in this case, it is not bright spot. It is dull white. Now, what do you mean by dull white? The idea of dull white means faint. Faint white, colorless white. It is dim. It is not a bright spot anymore. And so it is fading. So you can call it dull white, faint white, colorless, dim. The idea here is that it describes to the Kohanim that it's no longer active. And so he is declared as clean. He is taher. As for the man whose hair has fallen from his head, and he is bald, in this case, so he is clean because you can see everything. He whose hair has fallen from his forehead and is bald on the forehead, but in what can be seen, he is clean. So this description is that there is no white spots, white patches. If they're on the bald head or the bald forehead, then you see this, a little reddish white source. See again, the whiteness is an indicator then it is leprosy breaking out on his bald head or bald forehead. This is Zara. It is a very strict rule. The moment you have Zara, you are unclean and everybody will stay out of your place. Then we are told, then the priest shall look at it closely, and indeed, if the swelling of the inflammation, we can tell that if there is an infection and inflammation, some viral activity, there will be swelling and there will be reddish white. So you see reddish white, everything you see, there is some form of white on his bald head or bald forehead as the appearance of Zara on the skin of the body. He is a Zara man. He is one that has been struck by the Zara. He has a skin disease. So he has a Zara. He is then declared as unclean. The priest shall surely pronounce him unclean. His sore is on his head. This is where the Zara is happening. Verse 45. Now the leper. The word leper is one who has Zara. Right? One who has Zara, on whom the sore of the Zara is, his clothes shall be torn, his head bare shaven, he shall cover his mustache, because as a gentleman of the Israelite tribes, they are obliged to keep a beard. And so they're not supposed to shave the beard. And so he needs to cover the beard. The idea of covering here is to wrap his mustache. And he has to call out. The reason why he has to call out is that he has to inform the people around him, unclean, unclean. He has to call out, Tameh, Tameh, so that the people know to avoid him. He shall be Tameh. Why? Because he is now a leper. He has this for a longer period. All the days, in verse 46, all the days he has the nega. He has this leprosy sore, right? This nega. He shall be always be unclean. He's already declared, and now he has to tell everyone he is unclean and he must dwell alone. This idea of dwell alone literally means he must sit by himself. This is a form of quarantine. King Uzziah in Isaiah chapter 6 was one such person. When he was struck by God with Zara, with leprosy, he was dwelling outside the camp. In fact, they built a house for him at the graveyard so that he can be alone away from everybody else. And it was his son who was actually reigning in his place. That is how serious the Zara is. The Zara needs to be very clear to everyone in the camp that he is unclean, he can contaminate you, and he can pass it on if you're not careful. Verse 47. Now, in verse 47, onwards, we are now looking at the Zara affliction, the leprous skin disease. This is the Negar Zara. When it is declared unclean, the person's garment is also contaminated. Very careful of dealing with a person with Zara or leprosy, as well as his clothing, his attire. So it tells us here that there is a law concerning the clothing. So whether it is woolen garment or linen garment, whether it is in the warp or woof of linen or wool, all of these, it doesn't matter what it is made of, expensive or cheap, whether in leather or anything made of leather, if the plate is greenish or reddish, this is a question. Is it green or red in the garment of in the leather, whether in the warp or in the woof or anything made of leather? The reason being is these are all visual. God says it is a leprous plague. It is a nega zara, and it shall be shown to the priest. So the priest has to see, examine the nega, and isolate the plague 7 days just to test whether it truly is. Then he shall look at this plague again on the seventh day. If the plague has spread in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, in the leather or anything made of leather, because this actually can reside in the garment. The plague is an active leprosy. It is tame. The reason being is if it spreads, then it is zara because it can grow. That is fundamentally it. And for the Kohanim to say that, and then he shall therefore burn that garment in which is the naga, whether warp, woof, wool, linen, anything of leather, for it is an active leprosy. Now, this idea of active leprosy means it is a zara that is active. That garment shall be burned in fire. This is the treatment of the clothes. Burn. Now, obviously, the priests who are inspecting, as you can tell, show it, inspect it. The priest doesn't touch them. The priest only visually inspect. That is the way that it's done. We're now in the last segment, again continuing on with regards to the clothing. But if the priest examines, inspects, and this is visual, and indeed the plague, the nega, has not spread in the garment, whether in the warp, woof, anything made of leather, the priest shall command that they wash the thing in which there is the plague. Now, this idea of wash again, immerse. There is no such concept of sprinkling. And after washing, quarantine it. Nobody touches it for another 7 days. It's the same process, really. Then the priest shall observe carefully again and check for the plague after it has been washed and after 7 days. And if the plague has not changed its color, though the plague has not spread, it is unclean. The color is still active leprosy. So it is still considered unclean. Doesn't matter whether it's moved or not. So there are two conditions. Spread, whether it's deeper than the skin. In this case, it's on the clothing. Whether the color has changed. The white color is a telltale sign of leprosy. If this be the case, then you shall burn it in the fire. It continues eating away the clothes. The damage is outside or inside, whether you can see it or not. Next, if the priest looks at it, and indeed the plague has faded after washing it. Now, this idea of faded means grow dim. Grow dim means it is passing the active stage to an inactive stage. After washing, immersing, then he shall tear it out of the garment, whether out of the warp, out of the woof, out of the leather. And when he tears it out, notice this idea of tear out is literally to rend away. Rend away. Uh, I guess you can also call it cut it out. That would be the idea is don't allow it to fester in case it's going to contaminate the rest of the clothing. But if it appears again in the garment, after you've cut it out, the garment gets another of the sign of the plague, either in the warp or the woof or anything made in leather, then it is spreading, and you shall burn it with fire, in which is the plague. This is, you've determined that it is active. Then it says here, if you happen to immerse the garment, either warp or woof, whatever made of leather, if the plague has disappeared from it, then it shall be washed a second time. And this idea is immersed. Immersed a second time. This is the way of washing. And then it shall be clean. It shall be clean, and that is taher. We need to pay attention that this is the Torah. This is the Torah of the Nega Zara. This is Nega Zara. Notice it's all very similar in a garment or wool or linen, either in warp or woof, in anything made of leather, to pronounce it clean or pronounce it unclean. To pronounce it unclean or to pronounce it clean. So the entire idea here that you can see, it's about the pronouncement by the Kohen. As you can see, whether we call it anything, that the way that the unclean and clean is being treated here is to avoid contamination and avoid people being contaminated. And so there is a concept of testing, waiting, washing, isolating, quarantine, and if it continues, the clothing be burned. That is the only way of treatment of the Zara strike or the Zara sore or the Zara plague. Now, some translations does call it differently, right? Some calls it mildew or some other words. But the intent to show us here is that these are not your regular spores. This is not mushroom spores. This is real plague because it eats into the natural fibers. It doesn't grow on unnatural things. It only grows on natural things, and it will spread. And so the idea of unclean must be inspected by the priest. And the priest will determine whether it is clean or unclean, because the priest is the guardian of who can come to God. Only clean can come to God, and unclean cannot. And more importantly, if it is a skin disease type, that person needs to be isolated far away from the camp so that nobody will come near. And so he has to declare himself unclean so that everyone will stay away. That is the culture, that is the rule, and that is the instruction given by God. And as you can tell from chapter 13, Zara or some of these contaminating or skin disease that can spread easily needs to be checked, needs to be carefully examined to make sure that not only they can't come to the temple or the tabernacle, they can't come near other people who are clean, who doesn't have that same. And so the priest has a lot of work to do. The priest is not physically handling it. The priest knows what to do and how to handle the burning. We're not told exactly how the burning is, but we're just told that it needs to be burned. And so there is a lot of oral tradition, oral instruction that goes to them. Whatever we read is for us to appreciate the job of the Kohanim as a guardian of who is clean and unclean to allow them to be able to come near to God to make an offering. I trust that we are all clear that this is the principle. God's house, God's rules. The Torah is given of how to deal with such uh, violent and very active type of zara so that the people are protected and the temple and the tabernacle of God is kept absolutely clean. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.